The moment you assume someone doesn't belong, you may be writing the first line of your own downfall. The flashing red and blue lights painted long streaks across the quiet highway as morning commuters slowed just enough to witness another routine traffic stop, or so they thought. A silver sedan rested calmly on the shoulder, its engine still running, while a young white rookie officer stepped out of his patrol vehicle with the confidence of someone eager to prove himself. Officer Ethan Walker had dreamed about wearing the badge since childhood. Fresh out of the academy, he believed instinct was just as valuable as experience, and on only his 4th week of solo patrol, he was determined not to overlook anything that seemed suspicious. He straightened his uniform, adjusted the body camera clipped to his chest, and approached the driver's window with measured steps, unaware that every movement, every word, and every decision would soon be preserved forever by more than one camera. Inside the sedan sat a distinguished black man wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, a crisp white shirt, and a conservative burgundy tie. His short hair was neatly trimmed with subtle streaks of silver around the temples, giving him the quiet dignity of someone who had spent decades carrying responsibility without demanding attention. His name was Marcus Ellison, though no one standing on that roadside knew it yet. His leather briefcase rested on the passenger seat beside a stack of carefully organized legal documents, and a cup of untouched coffee sat in the center console, already cooling as the unexpected stop delayed his morning. Marcus lowered the window before the officer reached the door and offered a calm, respectful greeting. His voice was steady, his expression composed, revealing none of the frustration that most drivers might have shown. He understood that traffic stops were part of public safety, and throughout his life, he had learned that patience often revealed more than anger ever could. Ethan barely acknowledged the greeting. Instead, his eyes scanned the interior of the vehicle, lingering on the briefcase, the expensive watch, and the polished shoes before. Returning to Marcus's face, something about the scene unsettled him, though he couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was the confidence of the man behind the wheel. Perhaps it was simple inexperience searching for certainty where none existed. The morning air felt unusually still as passing vehicles rolled by at 65 miles per hour, their drivers stealing curious glances before continuing down the interstate. A delivery truck slowed. A family SUV drifted into the next lane. A teenager in a pickup instinctively lifted a phone toward the window. None of them realized they were witnessing the beginning of an encounter that would soon dominate headlines across the country. Ethan requested Marcus's license and registration in a firm voice. Marcus nodded politely and informed him that his wallet was inside his jacket pocket before moving slowly, deliberately, making sure every motion could be clearly seen. Yet instead of easing the tension, the careful movements seemed only to deepen the rookie officer's suspicion. Every second stretched longer than the last. Hidden above the windshield, the patrol car's dashcam continued recording without emotion, capturing a story that neither man yet understood was already far bigger than either of them. Marcus slowly removed his driver's license and vehicle registration exactly as he had described, placing both documents carefully on the edge of the open window before pulling his hands back into plain sight. His movements were deliberate, almost practiced, reflecting years of understanding that calm often prevented misunderstandings from becoming something larger. Officer Ethan Walker accepted the documents without a word. Instead of examining them immediately, he continued studying the man sitting behind the wheel. Everything about Marcus appeared orderly. The interior of the sedan was spotless. There were no open containers, no clutter, no signs of panic or impatience. The leather briefcase remained closed on the passenger seat, its brass clasp catching the morning sunlight. A legal pad rested beside it, filled with neatly written notes that could not be read from outside the vehicle. Ethan finally glanced down at the license. The name read Marcus Ellison. The address belonged to an affluent neighborhood less than 15 miles away. Nothing about the identification raised any obvious concern, yet the young officer hesitated. He looked back toward Marcus, whose composed expression never changed. "Where are you headed this morning, sir?" Ethan asked. "Downtown," Marcus answered. I have an important commitment that begins shortly. The answer was truthful, but intentionally brief. Marcus believed people should answer questions honestly without volunteering unnecessary information. During decades in public service, he had learned that humility was often mistaken for weakness, yet he refused to allow status to become the first thing people noticed about him. Ethan glanced once more toward the briefcase. "What kind of commitment?" he asked. Marcus smiled politely. "A professional obligation." The response seemed to frustrate the rookie officer more than reassure him. He shifted his weight, taking another careful look through the side windows, as if expecting to discover something hidden in plain sight. Several more vehicles slowed as they passed, their occupants quietly observing from behind windshields before disappearing down the interstate. The flashing emergency lights reflected across polished chrome and passing trailers, creating an almost surreal rhythm against the otherwise peaceful morning. Ethan stepped back toward his patrol vehicle, carrying the license with him. Inside, he entered Marcus's information into the computer terminal. The screen returned a valid driver's license with no outstanding warrants, no criminal history, and no alerts requiring additional enforcement. Everything appeared completely ordinary. Ethan frowned. He had expected something unusual, something that would justify the uneasy feeling he could not explain. Instead, every record confirmed that Marcus Ellison was simply a law-abiding citizen. The rookie leaned back in his seat, replaying the encounter in his mind. His field training officer had repeatedly reminded him never to let assumptions replace evidence. Yet another lesson echoed, just as loudly inside his head. Stay alert. Criminals can appear respectable. Unsure which instinct deserved his trust, Ethan decided to continue the stop rather than conclude it. Outside, Marcus remained exactly where he had been instructed. His hands rested comfortably on the steering wheel. He watched the patrol car through the rearview mirror, but made no attempt to hurry the process. His schedule mattered, but not more than maintaining respect during a public encounter. He had presided over countless proceedings where patience revealed character more clearly than words ever could. Across the highway, a road maintenance worker paused beside his service truck and quietly observed the scene from a distance. Nearby, another passing driver lowered a phone after recording several seconds before continuing on. None of them could have imagined that ordinary pieces of digital footage from an otherwise quiet Tuesday morning would soon become some of the most carefully examined recordings in a federal civil case. Officer Ethan Walker stared at the glowing computer screen for several more seconds, hoping that a hidden alert or overlooked detail would justify the uneasy feeling that refused to leave him. There was nothing. Every line of information confirmed that Marcus Ellison had a spotless driving record and no history of criminal conduct. Even the vehicle registration was current. Yet instead of accepting what the evidence clearly showed, Ethan convinced himself that experienced criminals often knew how to appear beyond suspicion. He stepped back out of the patrol car with renewed determination, the morning sun now climbing higher above the highway and casting long reflections across the silver sedan. Marcus noticed the officer approaching again and lowered his eyes briefly toward the steering wheel before looking back up. His expression remained calm, neither confrontational nor submissive. Years of serving in the legal system had taught him that respect for the process mattered most when the process became uncomfortable. Ethan stopped beside the driver's window and returned the license without saying a word. Marcus accepted it politely and waited for the officer to continue. Instead of ending the stop, Ethan asked another question. "Would you mind stepping out of the vehicle for me?" Marcus blinked once, surprised by the unexpected request. "May I ask the reason, officer?" he replied in the same measured tone he had maintained from the beginning. Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "I need to complete a few additional checks." Marcus looked directly at him, searching for some explanation that matched the circumstances, but the young officer offered nothing more. For a brief moment, the only sounds were passing tires against the pavement and the distant rumble of a tractor-trailer crossing an overpass. Marcus slowly unfastened his seatbelt, opened the driver's door, and stepped onto the shoulder. He carefully closed the door behind him without slamming it, and stood with his hands relaxed at his sides. His tailored suit remained perfectly pressed despite the warm breeze sweeping across the interstate. Ethan observed every movement closely, almost expecting something unusual to happen. Nothing did. Marcus simply stood quietly, waiting for instructions. Drivers passing by continued to glance toward the flashing patrol lights. A few slowed enough to notice the contrast between the composed businessman standing beside the sedan and the visibly tense rookie officer pacing around the vehicle. One elderly couple exchanged concerned looks before continuing on their way. A commercial delivery van passed with a dashboard camera pointed directly toward the shoulder, unknowingly preserving another angle of the encounter. Ethan walked a slow circle around the sedan, peering through every window. The briefcase remained exactly where it had been. The legal documents had not moved. There were no suspicious items in plain view, only neatly folded reading glasses, a folded newspaper, and a small framed photograph partially visible beneath a folder on the passenger seat. Marcus remained silent throughout the inspection. He resisted the natural urge to explain who he was or why he was traveling downtown. His title had opened many doors throughout his career, but he believed genuine fairness could only exist if every citizen deserved equal treatment before anyone's profession became relevant. As the silence stretched longer, Ethan felt increasing pressure to justify the direction the stop had taken. The situation had quietly evolved beyond a simple traffic violation, yet no objective evidence supported his growing suspicion. Still, pride can be difficult to recognize while it is shaping a decision. The rookie officer convinced himself that backing away now would make him appear uncertain. Standing beneath the bright morning sky with multiple cameras silently recording every passing second, neither man realized that the next decision would transform an ordinary roadside stop into a lesson that would soon be examined inside courtrooms, classrooms, and police training programs across the nation. Marcus stood quietly beside the sedan as the warm breeze carried the distant sound of traffic across the highway. His posture remained relaxed, his shoulders straight, and his hands rested naturally where they could be seen. He had no intention of making the situation more difficult than it already was. Officer Ethan Walker stopped a few feet away, studying him with the uncertainty of someone who no longer trusted the facts but was not ready to admit it. The silence between them stretched for several long seconds until Ethan finally spoke. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time. Is there anything inside that vehicle I should know about?" Marcus answered exactly as he had answered every previous question. "There are legal documents, personal belongings, and my briefcase. Nothing unlawful." His voice never rose. His expression never changed. Instead of bringing the encounter to a close, Ethan felt even more convinced that something about Marcus was unusual. The confidence, the measured speech, and the complete absence of nervousness somehow made the rookie officer believe he was missing something important. Looking back later, he would struggle to explain why calm behavior had begun to feel suspicious in his mind. A state trooper drove past in the opposite direction, but continued without stopping. A school bus rolled by carrying children who briefly turned toward the flashing patrol lights before disappearing down the interstate. The ordinary rhythm of the morning continued while the encounter quietly drifted farther away from its original purpose. Ethan took a slow breath before making another decision. "Please place your hands behind your back until I finish securing the scene," he said. Marcus looked at him with genuine surprise. "Officer, am I being detained?" Ethan answered, "At this moment, I need you to follow my instructions." Marcus paused only long enough to process what he had heard. He knew the legal distinction between a routine traffic stop and a detention better than almost anyone in the country. Yet he also understood that arguing on the shoulder of a busy highway would accomplish nothing. Without raising his voice or questioning the officer further, he slowly complied exactly as instructed. Several passing drivers immediately noticed the change. One woman slowed her vehicle just enough to glance toward the shoulder before continuing on. Another driver lowered his window slightly, looking back through the mirror with visible confusion. A delivery driver mounted on the dashboard of his van continued recording automatically as the patrol lights reflected across the windshield. Ethan carefully completed the detention while repeatedly glancing toward the roadway, unaware that every movement remained fully visible to both his own dash camera and body camera. Marcus stood quietly, offering no resistance and making no attempt to invoke his position. Instead, he focused on remaining composed. Years spent inside courtrooms had taught him that dignity was often tested long before justice arrived. The metal roadside guardrail shimmered beneath the growing sunlight while the minutes continued slipping away. Marcus knew that an important federal hearing was scheduled to begin soon, and several attorneys would already be gathering inside the courthouse, expecting him to preside. Still, he chose silence over confrontation. He believed that if the situation had been created by assumptions rather than evidence, then evidence would eventually become the only thing that mattered. Back inside the patrol vehicle, Ethan radioed dispatch to report that the driver had been temporarily detained pending additional investigation. The dispatcher acknowledged the update but sounded slightly puzzled, asking whether any specific violation beyond the original traffic stop had been identified. Ethan hesitated before replying that he was still assessing the situation. That brief pause, lasting only a few seconds, would later become one of the most discussed moments in the official review, because uncertainty, once captured on a recording, can become more revealing than certainty ever intended to be. Dispatch forwarded the update to a supervising sergeant for routine awareness, but the response that came back over the radio was not what Officer Ethan Walker expected. The dispatcher calmly asked him to verify the driver's full name one more time, because another government database had automatically returned a restricted notification that required additional confirmation before any further action could be taken. Ethan glanced at the driver's license again. Marcus Ellison, he repeated, carefully spelling the last name letter by letter. There was a brief silence on the radio. It lasted only a few seconds, yet it felt much longer beneath the growing heat of the late morning sun. Marcus remained exactly where he had been instructed, saying nothing, watching traffic flow steadily past the shoulder of the interstate. His breathing remained slow and controlled. Although he understood that every passing minute increased the likelihood that court personnel would begin wondering why he had not arrived, he refused to let frustration dictate his behavior. Throughout his career, he had reminded countless people that patience often revealed the truth more effectively than confrontation. Today, he quietly followed the same principle himself. Across the highway, another motorist slowed enough to observe the unusual scene. The driver noticed the sharply dressed man standing calmly beside the patrol vehicle and instinctively reached for a phone mounted near the dashboard. A construction crew working farther down the shoulder also glanced toward the flashing lights before returning to their tasks. Without realizing it, more independent recordings were quietly preserving pieces of the encounter from different angles. Inside the patrol car, Ethan tapped the steering wheel while waiting for dispatch to answer. His confidence from earlier that morning had begun to fade, replaced by an uncomfortable uncertainty he could not explain. Nothing about the situation had unfolded the way he imagined during training. The driver had remained respectful. Every document had been valid. No evidence had supported additional suspicion. Yet he had continued moving forward, convincing himself that certainty would eventually appear if he simply looked long enough. The radio finally came alive again. This time the dispatcher's voice sounded noticeably more measured. "Officer Walker, can you confirm whether the individual has identified his occupation?" Ethan looked through the windshield toward Marcus before answering. "No, he only stated that he has a professional obligation downtown." Another pause followed. The dispatcher quietly replied, "Stand by. We are verifying additional information." Ethan stepped back outside, trying to appear composed despite the growing uncertainty in his own mind. Marcus looked toward him, but waited for the officer to speak first. Instead, Ethan simply asked whether there was anyone Marcus wished to contact. Marcus answered gently, "I appreciate the question, officer, but I believe it is best to allow your process to continue." That answer lingered in Ethan's thoughts. Most people in similar circumstances would have immediately called an attorney, a family member, or a supervisor. Marcus requested none of those things. His confidence seemed rooted not in influence, but in faith that facts would eventually speak for themselves. Several hundred miles away, federal court staff had already begun reviewing the day's calendar, quietly noticing that Judge Ellison had not yet checked into the courthouse. His courtroom deputy attempted to reach him by telephone, but the call went unanswered because his phone remained inside the sedan. Concern slowly replaced routine as the scheduled hearing approached. Back on the interstate, the only witnesses were passing strangers, silent cameras, and a rookie officer who still believed he was searching for answers, unaware that the most important answer had already been sitting in his hand since the moment he first examined the driver's license. The radio remained silent long enough for Officer Ethan Walker to begin questioning every decision he had made since activating his emergency lights. Then the speaker crackled to life once more. This time the dispatcher spoke carefully, choosing each word with unusual precision. "Officer Walker, our records indicate the individual may be connected to the federal judiciary. We need you to confirm the date of birth on the driver's license and remain where you are." Ethan frowned, reading the information aloud exactly as it appeared. Another pause followed. He could hear distant keyboard strokes through the open radio channel before a second voice quietly joined the conversation. It belonged to the communications supervisor. "Officer Walker, do not take any additional enforcement action until we complete identity verification." Ethan felt a knot forming in his stomach. He looked toward Marcus, who continued standing calmly beneath the bright morning sky with the same quiet composure he had shown from the beginning. There was no anger on his face, no visible frustration, only the patient expression of someone who understood that truth often required time to catch up with assumptions. Miles away, inside the federal courthouse, concern had grown into urgency. The courtroom deputy informed the chief clerk that Judge Marcus Ellison had missed a scheduled pre-trial conference for the first time in more than 2 decades on the bench. Phone calls continued going unanswered. Staff members checked his calendar twice, then contacted courthouse security to determine whether anyone had seen him arrive. Nobody had. Back on the highway, Ethan finally walked toward Marcus again. "Sir, is there anything you would like to tell me that might help clarify this situation?" he asked, his voice noticeably less confident than before. Marcus met his eyes without hesitation. "Officer, I have answered every question honestly. I have followed every instruction. I believe your department will soon have all the information it needs." Ethan searched Marcus's face for signs of sarcasm or arrogance, but found neither. The answer was respectful, almost reassuring. Before he could respond, the radio interrupted once again. "Officer Walker, we have positive confirmation." The dispatcher stopped briefly before continuing. "The individual is the Honorable Marcus Ellison, United States District Judge. Repeat, identity has been confirmed through federal records." For several seconds, Ethan did not move. The words seemed to hang in the air as passing traffic continued flowing beside them. His eyes shifted slowly from the radio microphone to the driver's license still resting in his hand, then back toward the man standing quietly only a few yards away. Nothing about Marcus had changed. The only thing that had changed was Ethan's understanding of who had been standing in front of him all along. The dispatcher continued speaking. "A supervising sergeant is en route. Please maintain the scene and await further instructions." Ethan lowered the radio without replying immediately. The realization settled heavily over him. Every interaction, every question, every decision, and every unnecessary delay had been documented by his body camera, the patrol vehicle dash camera, nearby motorists, and dispatch recordings. Marcus remained composed, offering neither criticism nor satisfaction. He simply waited. In that quiet moment, the morning no longer belonged to assumptions or appearances. It belonged to facts, and facts have a way of remaining unchanged no matter how long they are ignored. The arrival of the supervising sergeant changed the atmosphere immediately, but not because anyone raised a voice. Experience has a way of replacing confidence with careful observation. Sergeant Daniel Harper stepped out of his vehicle, surveyed the scene for only a few moments, and noticed something that Ethan had overlooked from the very beginning. Marcus Ellison was standing exactly where he had been instructed, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, his cooperation complete. Harper approached Marcus first. "Sir, thank you for your patience," he said respectfully. Marcus acknowledged him with a slight nod. "I appreciate your professionalism, Sergeant." There was no accusation in his voice, no attempt to embarrass the young officer standing several feet away. Harper then turned toward Ethan and quietly asked him to explain every step of the encounter from the initial stop until the present moment. Ethan spoke honestly, describing the traffic violation, the questioning, the records check, and the decision to continue investigating despite receiving no evidence of criminal activity. As he explained each decision aloud, the gaps in his own reasoning became impossible to ignore. Harper listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, the sergeant simply asked one question. What objective fact justified extending the detention after the records came back clear? Ethan searched for an answer, but none came. The silence that followed said more than any explanation could have. Harper requested that dispatch preserve every available recording connected to the incident, including radio traffic, body camera footage, dash camera footage, and computer activity logs. He also instructed another responding supervisor to identify any nearby traffic cameras that may have captured portions of the stop. Standard procedure suddenly became much more comprehensive because everyone understood that transparency depended on evidence, not memory. Marcus quietly observed the conversation without inserting himself into it. His restraint left a lasting impression on everyone present. He had every opportunity to announce his title the moment the encounter became uncomfortable, yet he never had. Instead, he had chosen to let the process reveal its own strengths and weaknesses. Harper walked back toward Marcus. "Sir, you're free to continue your day. On behalf of this department, I apologize for the delay." Marcus offered a courteous smile. "Thank you, Sergeant. I accept your apology, but I hope the department also studies what happened here. The lesson is larger than either one of us." Those words settled over the roadside with remarkable weight. They were not spoken in anger. They were spoken with the quiet conviction of someone who had spent a lifetime believing that institutions become stronger only when they are willing to examine themselves honestly. As Marcus returned to his sedan, Ethan remained standing beside the patrol vehicle, watching silently. For the first time since graduating from the academy, he understood that good intentions alone could never replace disciplined judgment. Every assumption made without evidence carried consequences that reached far beyond a single morning. Before leaving, Marcus paused briefly, looked toward the young officer, and said one final sentence. "The law asks us to judge actions, never appearances." Then he entered his vehicle and drove toward the federal courthouse, where an entire courtroom had been waiting for his arrival. Behind him, the flashing patrol lights were finally turned off, but the recordings created during those quiet minutes would continue illuminating the truth long after the roadside had returned to ordinary traffic. The weeks that followed transformed a quiet roadside encounter into one of the most closely examined administrative reviews the department had seen in years. Internal Affairs collected every available piece of evidence before conducting a single interview. The patrol vehicle dash camera was synchronized with the body camera recording down to the exact second. Dispatch audio was matched against computer activity logs. Traffic camera footage confirmed the timeline from multiple intersections, while recordings voluntarily provided by passing motorists filled in the remaining gaps. Together, they formed an uninterrupted record that required no speculation and left very little room for conflicting interpretations. Every decision could now be viewed exactly as it happened rather than remembered through emotion or hindsight. Investigators noticed that Marcus Ellison had remained consistently respectful from beginning to end. He answered every question directly, informed the officer before reaching for any document, followed every instruction without hesitation, and never attempted to use his judicial position to influence the encounter. The recordings also demonstrated that after routine database checks confirmed his identity, valid license, registration, and absence of criminal history, the detention continued, without any newly documented facts to support the extension. During administrative interviews, Officer Ethan Walker acknowledged that he had relied too heavily on instinct after failing to identify objective evidence justifying his growing suspicion. His honesty during the investigation was noted, but investigators concluded that good faith could never replace constitutional standards or established departmental policy. The review panel recommended extensive procedural reforms in addition to individual accountability. Supervisors revised field training materials, emphasizing that professional appearance, calm behavior, or personal assumptions could never substitute for articulable facts. Recruits would now study the recordings as part of classroom instruction, learning how quickly routine encounters could drift away from lawful procedure when confirmation bias quietly replaced objective observation. Marcus never requested special treatment throughout the investigation. He attended interviews only when necessary, answered questions with the same patience he had demonstrated on the roadside, and repeatedly reminded investigators that the purpose of accountability was improvement rather than humiliation. Nevertheless, the consequences extended beyond internal discipline. Civil rights attorneys representing Marcus filed a federal civil action alleging that the prolonged detention violated clearly established constitutional protections. Unlike the administrative review, the civil proceedings focused not on departmental policy, but on the measurable impact of the encounter itself. Expert witnesses analyzed the recordings frame by frame. Legal scholars testified regarding investigative standards during traffic stops. Former law enforcement trainers explained how objective facts should guide every decision after the initial purpose of a stop has been completed. Because nearly every important moment had been preserved by synchronized recordings, many factual disputes that typically dominate courtroom litigation simply did not exist. Months later, after extensive negotiations supported by the overwhelming documentary record, the municipality approved a settlement totaling $2,800,000. The agreement acknowledged no personal malice, but it recognized that constitutional protections exist precisely to prevent well-intentioned mistakes from becoming unlawful government action. Alongside the financial resolution came mandatory policy revisions, expanded supervisory oversight, and enhanced constitutional training for every new officer entering the department. News organizations across the country reported the outcome, but Marcus declined repeated requests for television interviews. He believed the recordings already told the story more honestly than any prepared statement ever could. For him, the most meaningful result was never the settlement itself. It was the possibility that somewhere in the future, another ordinary citizen traveling an ordinary highway might experience a different outcome because one department chose to learn from evidence instead of defending assumptions several months after the settlement was finalized. Life gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. But the lessons from that quiet morning continued traveling much farther than anyone had expected. Police academies requested permission to use portions of the recordings during constitutional policing courses. Law schools discussed the case when teaching the importance of objective standards during government encounters. Community organizations invited officers and legal professionals to participate in conversations about trust, accountability, and the responsibilities carried by every public servant. The story was no longer about one traffic stop. It had become a reminder that every interaction between a citizen and an officer has the power to strengthen or weaken public confidence. Marcus Ellison never sought recognition for what had happened. He returned to his courtroom the very next business day after the administrative process allowed him to resume his schedule. His calendar remained as full as ever. His rulings continued to reflect careful study of the law, and his demeanor never changed. Attorneys who appeared before him often remarked that he treated every person with the same respect, whether they represented a large corporation, a small business owner, or an ordinary family searching for justice. Few people entering his courtroom knew what he had experienced on the side of that highway, because Marcus rarely mentioned it. He believed that personal hardship should never overshadow the responsibility of serving others fairly. Officer Ethan Walker also faced a future very different from the one he had imagined when he first pinned on his badge. After completing the department's disciplinary process and extensive retraining, he spent countless hours reviewing the recordings himself. What troubled him most was not a single decision, but the chain of assumptions that quietly influenced one choice after another. He came to understand that professionalism demanded constant discipline over personal perception. Years later, when speaking with new recruits during training sessions, he openly admitted that confidence without humility could become a dangerous combination. Rather than hiding from his mistake, he chose to help others avoid repeating it. Sergeant Daniel Harper eventually reflected that the most remarkable person at the scene had not been the supervisor, the dispatcher, or even the young rookie officer. It had been the man who possessed every reason to become angry, yet chose patience instead. Marcus understood that dignity is not measured by how people treat us during our best moments. It is revealed by how we respond during our most difficult ones. On a quiet autumn afternoon, nearly a year after the encounter, Marcus drove along the same stretch of interstate where everything had begun. The shoulder looked exactly as it always had. Cars passed by. Families traveled toward weekend destinations. Delivery trucks continued their routes. Nothing about the highway suggested that an event discussed across the nation had unfolded there. Marcus slowed briefly as he passed the familiar location before continuing toward the city skyline. There was no bitterness in his expression, only quiet reflection. Some roads carry memories long after the tire marks disappear. Before entering the courthouse that morning, Marcus paused for a moment beneath the courthouse steps as sunlight reflected. Across the stone columns behind him, he looked toward the American flag moving gently in the breeze and smiled almost imperceptibly. Justice, he had learned once again, does not begin with a robe, a badge, or a courtroom. It begins with the simple decision to see another human being before making any judgment at all. Because when evidence finally speaks, assumptions always lose their voice. Please like and subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of justice.